Ukrainian Air Force fighter Su-27, steered by two experienced pilots, was entering a rolling figure with downward trajectory. All of a sudden, the plane crashed into the ground.
In 2002, the mighty Su-27 fighter jet, performing at an air show in Ukraine, turned that excitement into unspeakable tragedy. During a high-speed maneuver, the jet spiraled out of control, crashing into a crowd of spectators and unleashing the deadliest airshow disaster in history. Hundreds were injured, and dozens lost their lives in mere moments. What caused this catastrophic event, and how did it spiral so far out of control? The answers are in the chilling images from that dreadful day. Join us as we unravel the story of this heartbreaking disaster. Red flags in the sky. The morning of July 27, 2002, dawned bright and promising over Lviv airfield. Ukrainian flags fluttered in the gentle breeze as military officials bustled about, preparing for what should have been a proud celebration of the 14th Air Corps' 60th anniversary. But beneath the surface of this festive atmosphere, a web of fatal decisions was already being woven. Volodymyr Toponar, a veteran pilot with 27 years in the cockpit, looked at the airfield with growing concern. His weathered face showed the experience of countless flights, but something felt off today. He had requested practice flights to familiarize himself with Lviv's unique layout, a standard safety procedure that any seasoned pilot would expect. The Air Force's response? A flat denial, citing budget constraints. Too expensive, they said. The irony was bitter for a military show celebrating 6 decades of aviation excellence. In the days leading up to the show, local pilots who knew the airfield like the backs of their hands began raising red flags. They saw the chaos in the preparation phase, rushed decisions, poor communication, and a concerning lack of attention to safety protocols. One pilot, after witnessing the disorganization firsthand, made the bold decision to withdraw from the show entirely. But the warning signs went unheeded. Instead of addressing these concerns, military officials pushed forward, driven by the pressure to deliver a spectacular show. The situation worsened when organizers made a last-minute decision that would prove catastrophic. They moved the entire show's location from one side of the airfield to the other. This wasn't a simple shift of a few meters. It meant completely relocating spectator zones, changing flight paths, and restructuring the entire performance space. Yet somehow, this crucial information never made it to Toponar and his co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov. The military provided them with detailed intelligence briefings about the area, but these documents now contained outdated information. For Toponar, who had performed his planned routine countless times before, this created a dangerous disconnect between what he expected to see and what would be there. The Ukrainian Air Force's pride, the Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jet, sat waiting on the tarmac. This marvel of engineering could perform incredible maneuvers like Pugachev's Cobra, where the plane would seemingly stand on its tail in mid-flight. But even the most capable aircraft needs proper planning and preparation for a safe show. As the morning progressed, more cracks appeared in the facade. The flight parameters provided by the Air Force didn't match the actual terrain. Critical safety measures, standard at international air shows, were overlooked or ignored. The distance between the aircraft and spectators, emergency procedures, and clear communication channels, all these vital elements were compromised in the rush to put on a show. Senior military officials, more focused on the celebration than safety, dismissed concerns raised by ground crew and technical staff. Their attitude seemed to be that a senior pilot like Toponar could handle any situation. After all, as they reasoned, military pilots regularly operate in unfamiliar territory during wartime operations. But an air show isn't a war zone. It's a carefully choreographed dance between pilot, machine, and environment, where every variable needs to be controlled and accounted for. The chaos of last-minute changes, poor communication, and ignored safety protocols were creating a perfect storm. As crowds began filling the spectator areas, no one realized they were walking into carefully constructed danger zones. The revised layout placed viewers in positions that violated basic airshow safety guidelines. Emergency escape routes for aircraft, a crucial safety requirement, were compromised by the new arrangement. The morning ticked away, and with each passing hour, the pressure mounted on Toponar and Yegorov. They were expected to perform complex aerobatic maneuvers in an environment that had essentially become a mystery to them. Their requests for clarification were met with bureaucratic responses that provided little actual help. By the time the show was ready to begin, multiple layers of failures had already been set in motion. The combination of denied practice runs, last-minute location changes, miscommunication, and ignored safety protocols had created a deadly trap. All it would take was one small thing to go wrong, and the entire house of cards would come crashing down. The stage was set for what would become the deadliest airshow disaster in history. As the Su-27's engines roared to life, neither the pilots nor the excited spectators knew that they were about to become part of a tragic lesson in the devastating cost of ignored warnings and rushed decisions. As the warning signs piled up and safety protocols crumbled, the Su-27 thundered down the runway. But what horrifying chain of events would unfold in the next 4 minutes that would transform this celebration into one of Ukraine's darkest days? The fatal dance. The massive Su-27 fighter jet screamed through the summer air as Toponar gripped the controls. His hands, steady from decades of experience, felt the first troubling signs. Both engines were losing power. The aircraft's usual thunderous roar had dampened to an unsettling growl. At 200 meters above ground, the jet was already flying dangerously low. Toponar's mind raced through his options as he pulled up into a loop with a turn. This maneuver, which he had performed hundreds of times before, should have carved a graceful arc parallel to the watching crowd. Instead, the Su-27 was now heading straight toward them. The spectators below had no idea of the drama unfolding in the cockpit. They watched in awe as the massive war machine turned through the sky, its blue and yellow paint gleaming in the sunlight. Children pointed excitedly, parents recorded videos, and veterans nodded appreciatively, none aware that they were watching a disaster in motion. Inside the cockpit, warning lights flashed as the jet continued its deadly descent. Toponar fought against the controls, his muscles straining as he tried to pull the nose up. Beside him, co-pilot Yegorov monitored the rapidly dropping airspeed indicator. The ground rushed toward them with frightening speed.
The tragedy at Sknylev Airshow appeared to be on the top list of the bloodiest accidents throughout the history of air performances.
The first sign of imminent disaster came when the left wing sliced through a tree branch. The impact sent shudders through the entire aircraft. Metal screamed against wood, and fragments of leaves and branches scattered in the jet wash. For a heart-stopping moment, the wingtip scraped against concrete, sending sparks flying. Time seemed to slow down. The jet, now mere inches above the ground, skimmed past shocked onlookers. Their expressions changed from excitement to horror as they realized this was no planned stunt. Some began to run. Others stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were telling them. Ahead, a parked IL-76 transport plane loomed like a wall. Toponar knew they couldn't pull up in time. With split-second decision-making born from years of training, Yegorov pulled the ejection handle. The cockpit canopy blasted away as explosive charges fired beneath their seats. The force of ejection slammed both pilots with crushing G-forces as they were rocketed away from their doomed aircraft. Their parachutes deployed automatically, but they were still too close to witness what happened next. The Su-27, now pilotless, slammed into the parked transport plane. The impact was catastrophic. Metal tore into the metal with a deafening roar. The The fighter jet's momentum carried it through the collision, transforming it into a cartwheel of destruction. Fuel tanks ruptured, spreading burning aviation fuel across the airfield. As if guided by some cruel twist of fate, the wreckage plowed through a section of barbed wire fence. The sharp metal strands became deadly projectiles, adding to the shower of burning debris and shrapnel that swept through the crowd. The scene transformed into chaos, the sound of screaming mixed with the roar of flames. Those who could run did so, while others rushed toward the carnage to help the injured. The air filled with thick black smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel. Emergency vehicles, their sirens wailing, raced across the airfield. First responders, who had been stationed nearby for the show, found themselves facing a scene beyond their worst nightmares. Medical personnel worked frantically to help the injured, while firefighters battled the intense flames.
Hundreds more were severely injured. Today, the priests served a divine service in a chapel situated at the site of the catastrophe.
Toponar and Yegorov landed several hundred meters away, their parachutes collapsing onto the grass. Physically, they were barely hurt. The ejection system had saved their lives. But as they took in the scale of destruction before them, the psychological wounds were already cutting deep. Parents searched desperately for children. Children cried out to parents who couldn't answer. Veterans who had survived combat found themselves reliving nightmares they thought they'd left behind. One particularly heartbreaking scene unfolded as a pilot who had come to enjoy the show with his family discovered he had lost both his wife and one of his children. The beautiful summer day had transformed into a scene of unprecedented tragedy. What should have been a celebration of aviation excellence had become its darkest hour. Emergency workers continued their grim task as the smoke gradually cleared, revealing the full extent of the catastrophe. The airshow disaster at Lviv would forever change how the Ukrainian military approached such events. But for the families torn apart that day, for the children who lost parents and the parents who lost children, and for the survivors who would carry both physical and emotional scars, these lessons came at an unbearable cost. As the smoke cleared and the true horror of that fatal day settled over Lviv, one burning question remained. Who would be held responsible for turning a celebration into a graveyard? The answer would prove far more complex than anyone expected. Unraveling the tragedy. In the days following the crash, Ukraine's president stood before news cameras, his face grave as he promised justice. The nation demanded answers. How could a military display go so wrong? The investigation that followed would expose cracks in the system that ran far deeper than a single pilot's error. 2002. Air shows worldwide followed strict safety rules born from past tragedies. These rules were simple but vital. Planes should never fly directly over crowds. Spectators needed to stay far from danger zones. Every display area required clear escape routes for aircraft in trouble. Pilots had to keep safe distances and only perform stunts they knew well. But at Lviv, these life-saving rules might as well have been written in invisible ink. Planes had zoomed over the crowd all day. People stood packed together on both sides of the runway, leaving pilots nowhere safe to go if something went wrong. It was like building a house with no exits. Sooner or later, disaster would strike. The military's response was swift but narrow. They fired the head of the Air Force and pointed fingers at Toponar. The veteran pilot became their perfect scapegoat, a face they could blame for all that went wrong. In their story, he was just a reckless pilot who broke rules and tried dangerous moves too close to the ground. But this simple explanation started falling apart under a closer look. Toponar's 27 years of flying told a different story. He had done these same moves countless times before, always safely. Some evidence even showed he did everything right during the flight, evidence that mysteriously disappeared during his trial. The judges who would decide Toponar's fate worked for the Ministry of Defense, the same organization being investigated. It was like having a student grade their test. These judges ignored three huge problems that came to light. First, someone had given Topanar the wrong information about where people would be standing. It's like giving someone the wrong address for a delivery. They'll end up in the wrong place every time. Topanar had radioed for help when he realized something was wrong, but controllers just told him to keep flying. Second, the Su-27 jet itself was part of the problem. Ukraine's military planes were getting old, leftovers from Soviet times. Only 15 out of every 100 planes could fly safely. The Su-27 at the show had engine troubles that mechanics hadn't fixed properly. When Topanar reported these problems during the flight, ground control ignored his warnings. Third, the whole event was planned poorly from the start. It was like trying to put on a circus without safety nets or proper training. Some pilots had seen the danger coming. They refused to fly in the show at all. But the people in charge cared more about putting on a good show than keeping people safe. Yet the investigation focused only on Topanar. They blamed him for breaking the rules, even though the unsafe conditions weren't his fault. He indeed made one final mistake, trying a difficult move when he knew his engine was having problems. But this was just the last link in a long chain of failures. Behind the scenes, bigger issues lurked. Ukraine's military planes were falling apart. Money for proper maintenance had disappeared. Training wasn't what it should have been. Safety rules existed on paper, but were ignored in practice. Leaders pushed pilots to perform despite dangers, creating a culture where saying no could hurt your career. The investigation never looked deeply at these problems. They never asked why so many safety rules were broken before the crash. They didn't question why experienced pilots had warned about the dangers. They didn't investigate why proper maintenance records were missing. It was easier to blame one person than fix a broken system. In military aviation, there's a saying, every accident is a chain of events. Break any link in that chain, and you prevent disaster. At Lviv, many people could have broken that chain.
But after the Sknyliv crash, every Ukrainian should be more responsible at whatever they do in life.
Ground controllers could have stopped the show when Topanar reported problems. Organizers could have followed safety rules. Mechanics could have properly fixed the plane. Leaders could have listened to pilots' warnings. Instead, each person passed the responsibility to someone else. Like a hot potato, nobody wanted to hold. In the end, it landed in Topanar's lap, and he would carry the burden of blame for a disaster that many hands had built. The true failure at Lviv wasn't just in the sky that day, it was in the offices and hangars where decisions were made long before the crash. It was in the culture that valued spectacle over safety, and in the system that looked for someone to blame instead of something to fix. While the investigation exposed a broken system, the true cost of that fatal day would be measured not in broken rules, but in broken lives. How would Ukraine handle the aftermath of its deadliest peacetime disaster?
She stayed at home. Her mother, brother, uncle, and nephews went to the show and were all killed in the accident.
And what became of those left behind? The price of tragedy. The numbers tell only part of the story. 77 lives lost, 543 people injured. Behind each number was a family torn apart, a future erased, a life changed forever. In the quiet neighborhoods around Lviv, empty chairs at dinner tables and unused toys in children's rooms became silent monuments to that terrible day. The Ukrainian government's response to these shattered families came in the form of a shared compensation fund of $200,000, barely enough to cover funeral costs for all the victims. The distribution seemed random at best and cruel at worst. Some families received $40,000, while others got just $7,000. No one explained why some lives seemed worth more than others. The injured faced an even harder battle. Medical bills piled up, as they fought to recover, but the government's help was minimal. One story stood out among many: a 4-year-old boy found lying among the dead, somehow still alive. The trauma stole his voice and changed how his young mind worked. His family received just $2,000, not even enough for a month of the therapy he desperately needed. Local communities tried to fill the gap. Neighbors helped neighbors. Churches organized fundraisers. School teachers collected money for their students' families. But it wasn't enough to heal the deep wounds, both physical and emotional, that the disaster left behind. In the courts, justice moved slowly, but struck hard, at least for some. Toponar received the harshest sentence, 14 years in prison. His co-pilot, Yegorov, got 8 years. 3 other military officials faced shorter sentences of 4 to 6 years for negligence and breaking flight rules. The punishment seemed to fall harder on those at the bottom than those at the top. Today, Topar lives a life shaped by that fatal day. He must check in with authorities every month, like a student showing up for detention that never ends. He can't drive any vehicle, not even a bicycle. To get to his job, he rolls through the streets on rollerblades, a former fighter pilot reduced to wheels on the ground. The fines he must pay stretch into millions, more money than he could earn in several lifetimes. Each month, a portion of his earnings goes to pay for a disaster that many hands created, but he alone seems to bear the full weight of. Yet others involved in the tragedy faced lighter consequences. Yegorov and 2 senior officials walked free early, their sentences cut short. Another official who played a role in the disaster got only a suspended sentence and no prison time at all. Today, that person still works in the Air Force, their career barely touched by the tragedy they helped create. The crash changed how Ukraine handled air shows. New safety rules appeared on paper, but the most effective change was simple. Many people stopped attending air shows altogether. The empty bleachers at later events spoke of trust broken and memories too painful to revisit. For the children who lost their parents that day, life moved forward in the shadow of what happened. Some grew up to become advocates for airshow safety. Others left Ukraine, unable to live in a place where every military jet overhead brought back terrible memories. Many struggled with anger at a system that seemed more interested in finding someone to blame than in helping survivors heal. The disaster left marks on Ukraine's military reputation too. Other countries looked more carefully at Ukraine's aging fleet of Soviet-era planes. Questions arose about maintenance standards and training programs. Some international air shows stopped inviting Ukrainian military aircraft to perform. 20 years later, the scars remain visible. In Lviv, a memorial stands where happy families once watched a show turn to tragedy. Names carved in stone remind visitors of lives cut short.
It showed the crash from an angle she hadn't seen before. The footage shows the last moments in the lives of her family.
Fresh flowers appear regularly, proof that while time moves forward, memory stands still. The true legacy of the Lviv airshow disaster isn't just in changed rules or prison sentences. It lives in the stories of survivors who still jump at sudden loud noises. It lives in families who gather with empty chairs at holiday tables. It lives in the questions that still hang in the air. Could more have been done to help those left behind? Could the truth have been faced more honestly? Could the responsibility have been shared more fairly? For Toponar, each day brings a reminder of that fatal flight. As he rolls through Lviv's streets on his rollerblades, he carries not just his burden, but the weight of a system that needs someone to blame. His story serves as a warning about what happens when safety takes a backseat to spectacle, and when finding a scapegoat becomes more important than finding the truth. While the wounds of Sknyliv still run deep in Ukraine, its dark legacy sparked changes that reached far beyond its borders. How did this single tragic day reshape the future of airshows around the world? How Sknyliv changed air shows forever. When planes take to the skies at modern air shows, they dance through the air, following an invisible set of rules written in blood. After Sknyliv, air shows would never be the same. Countries worldwide took a hard look at their safety measures, realizing they too could be one mistake away from disaster. The first big change came in crowd placement. Today's air shows keep spectators much further from the action. Safety zones stretch for hundreds of meters beyond show areas. Special radar systems track every aircraft's position, making sure they never stray too close to the crowd. It's like having an invisible shield between the planes and people. Emergency teams now train specifically for airshow accidents. At every major show, specially equipped firefighters stand ready with foam trucks designed to handle aircraft fires. Medical teams prepare for large-scale emergencies, not just individual injuries. They even practice evacuating entire crowd sections in minutes. Pilot requirements tighten too. Before flying in shows, pilots must now prove they've practiced their routines many times at safe altitudes. They undergo special medical checks and can't perform if they're too tired or stressed. Each stunt must be approved weeks before the show, and pilots can't change their routines at the last minute. Weather monitoring became stricter. Shows now use advanced systems to track wind patterns and visibility. If conditions aren't perfect, dangerous stunts get cancelled. Some shows even have automatic shutdown systems that stop all flights if the weather turns bad. The way planes are maintained changed dramatically. Every aircraft in a show must pass thorough safety checks. Mechanics document every repair, every inspection, every tiny adjustment. Old military planes, like the Su-27 that crashed at Sknyliv, face extra scrutiny before they're allowed to fly at public events. But perhaps the biggest change happened in how shows are organized. Today's air shows have multiple layers of safety officers. Each one can stop the show if they spot something wrong. It's like having several lifeguards watching the same swimming pool. If one misses something dangerous, another will catch it. Insurance companies also played a surprising role in making shows safer. After Sknyliv, they started requiring strict safety measures before they would cover air shows. This forced organizers to either follow the new rules or cancel their events. Modern technology helps too. Pilots now use simulators to practice emergencies safely on the ground. Special computer programs plan flight paths to keep planes away from danger zones. Some aircraft even have automatic systems that prevent them from flying too low or too close to spectators. The changes worked. In the years since Sknyliv, airshow accidents dropped dramatically. While small incidents still happen, no disaster has come close to the scale of that terrible day in Ukraine. Each safe show proves that lessons learned from tragedy can save lives. Yet the most powerful change might be in attitude. Today's airshow community treats safety as their top priority. Pilots openly discuss close calls and share tips to avoid dangers. Show organizers work together across countries to improve safety standards. The old culture of the show must go on has been replaced by safety first, no exceptions. The price of these lessons was far too high, 77 lives that can never be replaced. But their loss forced the airshow world to change, creating safer skies for future generations to enjoy the magic of flight without the shadow of tragedy. While safety regulations reshaped air shows worldwide, the deepest impact of Sknyliv lies in the hearts of those who survived. What happens to a community when the blue summer sky becomes a reminder of their darkest day? Voices of the survivors. Natalia's hands still shake when she hears jets overhead. 17 years later, she and her sister remain the only survivors from their section of the crowd that day. "We stood facing it all," she says quietly, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. "First, it cut people, then it burned them. We were lucky, I guess. On that lane, my sister and I were the only ones to survive. The memorial site in Sniliv has become a gathering place for those left behind. Some come daily, others haven't found the strength to visit even once. Every visitor carries a different weight of loss. Parents who lost children, children who lost entire families, friends who lost friends. Irina's story shows how trauma can surface in unexpected ways. Years after the crash, she found a video online that showed her father and brother's final moments. They stood there holding hands, she says, her voice breaking. I see their shadows just as the plane goes down. They begin to run, and that's where the video stops. In the months following the disaster, survivors began finding each other. What started as chance meetings at the memorial site grew into organized support groups. Helena's story became a touchstone for many in these groups. On that sweltering July day, she had begged off, going to the air show, complaining about the heat. Her mother kissed her forehead and said, "Stay cool, sweetheart." Her brother teased her about being lazy. Her uncle joked that he'd take photos of everything she'd miss. Along with her 2 young nephews, they headed out the door, waving goodbye. It was the last time she would see any of them. Maybe only after about 6 months, I began realizing that my mom was gone, Helena reveals, and only after that, I really began to cry. The group helped her understand that her delayed grief was normal, and that trauma often unfolds in its own time. They showed me I wasn't going crazy when I'd suddenly burst into tears at the grocery store, seeing my mum's favorite cookies. For years, Helena couldn't bring herself to visit the crash site. The support group never pushed her, understanding that everyone's path through grief is different. If I came here in the first few years after it happened, I'd just cry. I didn't want there to be any more pain. Instead, they brought her photos of the memorial, shared stories of their visits, and waited until she was ready. When Helena finally visited the site, 10 years after the crash, she went with 6 other members of her support group. They stood with her as she traced her family's names on the memorial wall. They helped her place flowers. Most importantly, they were there when she finally allowed herself to say goodbye. The tragedy changed how local children view military aircraft. While once they might have dreamed of becoming pilots, many now flinch at Air Force recruiters visiting their schools. The sound of jets practicing at nearby bases, once exciting, now empties playgrounds as children rush inside. Emergency responders who worked that day formed their support network. Many left their jobs, unable to shake the memories of what they witnessed. Others threw themselves into improving emergency services, determined to be better prepared if a disaster ever struck again. Local teachers noticed changes in their students too. Children who lost family members often struggled with concentration. Some developed anxiety about loud noises or crowds. School counselors created special programs to help these students cope, programs that continue helping new generations deal with inherited trauma. The community's relationship with the military shifted dramatically. The air base, once a source of local pride, became a reminder of loss. Yet over time, some survivors worked to rebuild these broken bonds, recognizing that healing required understanding rather than blame. Irina, who lost multiple family members, speaks about finding a way forward. After the Sniliv crash, every Ukrainian should be more responsible at whatever they do in life. It's kind of an alarm bell for society, for Ukraine, that one should always have a proper attitude for work, because at some point, somewhere, people's lives will depend on you. Many survivors channeled their grief into advocacy work. They pushed for better airshow safety regulations, supported other communities affected by disasters, and worked to keep the memory of their loved ones alive through community service projects. The anniversary of the crash brings a different kind of quiet to Lviv. Shops close early, families gather at the memorial. Even those who weren't directly affected pause to remember. The city has learned to carry its grief with dignity, transforming personal tragedy into a commitment to prevent similar disasters. Today, the survivors of Sniliv continue sharing their stories, not to dwell in sorrow, but to ensure the lessons of that day aren't forgotten. Their voices remind us that behind every safety regulation, behind every protocol change, lie real people whose lives were forever altered by 4 minutes on a summer day in Ukraine. Perhaps the most powerful testament to human resilience comes from the younger generation, children of survivors and victims who have grown up carrying their parents' memories. Some have become safety engineers, determined to prevent future tragedies. Others work as trauma counselors, helping people process grief. A few even became pilots, not despite the tragedy, but because of it, committed to showing how aviation can heal rather than harm. Their stories prove that even from the darkest moments, new light can emerge. As one survivor's daughter, now a flight safety inspector, puts it, "We honor those we lost, not by living in fear of the sky, but by making sure it becomes safer for everyone." And that's all for today. Thanks for watching.